Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Wet Dream by Richard Wright.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So this album is actually an interesting one because it almost didn't make it on the list. I actually finished making the list, of course, before starting the year off, and this album was not on it, and only later did I realize that Richard Wright actually had his own solo albums, and I knew that I had to include one of them at least on the list, so I chose his, debut album and put it on here instead of a different album, which I don't know which one it is, so hopefully it wasn't something so good. But anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So Richard Wright, or as some of you may know him as Rick Wright, is of course the very well known keyboardist for Pink Floyd. He played with them basically from the beginning until technically the end, although he had an hiatus in between, so it's a lot of things. But this album is his debut album. It's called Wet Dream and it was released in 1978. Now on the list so far, we've actually reviewed most of David Gilmour's solo albums, so we had his first and his second and technically his third if you count a momentary lapse of reason. We have not yet encountered any solo albums by Roger Waters or Nick Mason, but luckily we are reviewing this one of Richard Wright today. Now this album was released in 1978. Now as I said, it's a pretty odd year to release an album like this considering the fact that Richard Wright was still with the band at this time, and a year prior they released Animals and a later year they released The Wall, so it's really like an odd thing. Like, when did he have time to work on this solo project? Because honestly they were making some of their best bangers at the time. Now it actually all makes quite a bunch of sense because if you look at the history you'll see that at the time basically Wright was being pushed out of the band by no other than Roger Waters. Now Waters didn't want Wright to be in. He wasn't credited on The Wall or Animals as being a contributing factor to the writing, and that's something a lot of fans until this day are very intrigued by because Richard Wright of course is a very much talented player and of course he contributed a lot of things into those two albums. But what you just have to understand is the fact that Wright knew what was coming and he started making his own music on his solo project. Now a quick disclaimer before we actually get into the review: this album is categorized as crossover prog, which means it's a more accessible version of prog, and I can totally see that as what it is because honestly Richard Wright wasn't really trying to go for a traditional progressive sound like he did with Pink Floyd. He was definitely going for something a whole lot more accessible on here, and still we are looking at this album because it has a lot of place in the history of progressiveness and the genre as a whole. Now one thing I really liked about this album is the way that Wright incorporated a lot of instruments and players on here, because honestly he could have written like a 45-minute long piano concerto, but he didn't. He actually wrote this entire album for multiple instruments, and it's really nice because the sound on here is varied and very cool. But what most surprised me about this album was actually the fact that Wright took some sort of a backseat on this album, at least when it comes to the keyboards. He actually put a lot of other instruments and players in the spotlight, mainly the saxophone and others, but on here he actually focused more on being the lead vocalist, and you know what, it's fine with me. I would have loved hearing more of his fantastic keyboard and piano playing, but honestly I'm fine with this as this is, and this album is quite split between songs which have him on the vocals and instrumental tracks. This album almost always goes with the structure of having one instrumental, one sung track, one instrumental, instrumental and vice versa. Now, when it comes to the singing of Richard Wright, I am kind of on the fence when it comes to, his vocal abilities, because he's not very capable in ways like, Roger Waters or David Gilmour, his band members, but he still does a great job at what he does. I liked more his performance on a track like Summer 68 from Atom Heart Mother. I think he sounds much younger and much better on there, and I also like his harmonies with Gilmour on the track of Echoes. But this album isn't all that, grandiose in any way. It's really chill, it's really mellow in some way, and it's very much what you'd expect from Richard Wright, and it's a very humble album as a whole. I really like the track of Cat Cruise. I think it's my favorite on here. I like instrumental tracks, but another track which I also liked quite a bit is Pink Song. Now that track, to me at least believe, is an ode to Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd, and I don't know, I just like the lyrics, I like the way it sounds, and both of them are really nice songs. And speaking about the lyrics, most lyrics on here were not actually written by Richard Wright himself, they were actually written by his then wife, Juliet Wright. She wrote most of the lyrics on here, and they're fine, they're not too interesting as a whole, but I guess they're doing their job. But as a general rule of thumb, I have to say that I much prefer the instrumental tracks on here rather than the sung tracks. But yeah, honestly, that's all I have to say about this. I don't think this album really is a memorable listen. I'm glad that I did listen to it, and I'm really glad that I know what it's all about. This album, I think, is technically quite criminally underrated. Not a lot of people know about it, not a lot of people knew about it when it was released, and honestly, for a pretty fine album as it is, I think it should get some more recognition. But for the sake of history and the knowing, I am glad that I gave this one a listen, because now I know a bit more about the individual members of Pink Floyd and what they're capable of and what they went on with their own pursuits. Of course, this cover was made by no other than the longtime friends of the band over at Hipgnosis. And this cover really sends all the right messages. It's really warm, it's relaxed, it's inspired in some odd way by water, like most of this album is, and I think most of all, it's very close and personal. I like how in first viewing of this cover, you don't really quite immediately understand what's going on. Like, it takes you a while until you realize, oh yeah, there's a boat and on the water, and that's actually a person lying on there, and there's a glass of green liquid right next to him, and then it all comes into like this one cohesive image. But beforehand, I don't know, I looked at this cover and I could have seen it in many ways until I really focused on it, but that just might be me, and honestly my brain is pretty surprising sometimes in its incapability of perceiving simple things. And honestly, it's a pretty lovely cover. I think the only thing I would have changed is just dismissing the glass with the green liquid inside of it. I don't think it really fits. I really like the fact that this cover has a simple color palette of having like blue and red and some sort of orangish yellow, but the green kind of puts it off to me, and I think it really doesn't fit all that well inside of there. But yeah, when it comes to the rating of this unusual album, well, at least unusual when it comes to prog terms, I think I'm gonna give this one an 8 out of 10. If I wasn't laying this off, this is a good album. It's really a good album. It's just not entirely progressive. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to something which is supposedly more progressive, although surprisingly not that much so. Of course, we're gonna be listening to Signals by Rush. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.